welcome back to our 6-week webinar, The Ideal Qualitative Study with a Quantitative Component. Again, William Bannon of StatsWhisperer, bringing you the presentation today. So where are we on our webinar agenda? Well, we are at week 4, right, where we are looking at the essentials of mixed methods research, right? So we're building up our crescendo, right? So we did our qualitative, we did our quantitative, right? Now we're putting them together with our mixed methods. So the first thing we should address is, what is mixed methods research, right? So the mixed methods research design is a procedure for collecting, analyzing, and mixing, right? The key word mixing, both quantitative and qualitative data into a single study to understand our research problem, right? Very succinct, very accurate description of mixed method studies. Okay, so when do you use mixed methods research, right? Well, today, apparently, right? So you use mixed methods research when you have both quantitative and qualitative data that together can provide you a better understanding of the research problem, right, than either one by themselves, right? So specifically, we get a more complete picture of the research problem. So the quantitative, telling trends, describing the variables, providing inferential analysis, while the qualitative are providing words, right, and showing us, a picture of the world the person, the research participant lives in, right? So when do we use it, right? So if we're building, right, building is an important one. So if we're building on one phase of the study to another, right, such as if we explore something, qualitatively, and we want to develop an instrument to measure that construct, which we're looking at, or as in our study, right, did we perform a quantitative analysis and we need a follow-up qualitative analysis to validate our results, see if anything is left out, provide more detail, right, and explain the findings. So staying with 7 steps, right, so we could say that a mixed method study has 7 steps, and we're going to go through each right now, right? So step 1, our study map, right, but this time is qualitative and quantitative. Recall we had like separate ones for the qualitative and quantitative in each respective study. Now we have it together, right? So step 2, determine if a mixed method study is feasible, right? Step 3, provide the rationale for the mixed method study, right? This may seem apparent, but if you ever write it down, it's often not as clear in your mind as you might think, right? So when you write down things like your rationale, right, and you have to state it definitively on paper or on a computer screen, as it were, it really comes out if the rationale is clear and makes sense. So it's important to actually do it, right? Step 4, right, select a design for the mixed method study. Step 5, collect the data, both quantitative and qualitative. Then step 6, where we're spending most of our time today, analyze the data, right, together. And step 7, report the results in a manuscript or report, the write-up and report. Now, you may say to yourself, you may say out loud, steps 2 through 5 are largely methodological, right? But, we're primarily concerned with data analysis in this webinar. So what's going on there? So keep in mind, steps 2 and 5 are important to data analysis because these steps impact how data analysis is conducted and likely the subsequent results, right? So the steps impact how the qualitative and quantitative data are merged, compared, used in tandem, etc., which we will illustrate. So other study designs, such as a purely quantitative or a purely qualitative, especially as you see here, the purely quantitative, right? The design has less impact on the data analysis, right? So if we're doing a quantitative analysis where it's one study time point, cross-sectional, we know specifically what tests we'll use, no matter how the data were collected. We said this earlier. The same thing if it's a pre and post with 2 time points or longitudinal with 3 or more time points. If it was a random sample, right, if it was a snowball sample, if it was a convenience sample, the data are all pretty much analyzed, in a methodological manner. But these having 2 types of data, right, combined makes our analysis more complex. Right? So that's the key term here, more complex. Right? We gotta think a little more about it. So step 1, right? So this is kind of a general representation of what we're going to do, right? So the study map tells us what are we going to do, right? And it's a general representation because you could list the quantitative and qualitative variables, individually, with our arrows to the dependent variable, but for our purposes here, we'll just keep it more general, which is fine too, because we have the other 2 study maps that do that. Right, so we have on the left our quantitative analysis results and the arrow going to class attendance. So how's class attendance impacted by our quantitative analysis results? And underneath, qualitative analysis results. How is class attendance explained by our qualitative results? Now 2. So that before was what we were going to do. Now step 2 is a study feasible. That tells us, can we do it, right? So we might want to consider several factors such as, does the researcher have quantitative and qualitative skills, right? What we covered in weeks 2 and 3. And so can the researcher effectively and proficiently perform quantitative and qualitative data analysis, right? 2, the time and resources, right? So the time and resources to do either one, a qualitative or a quantitative, might be considerable, right? So if you're going to do both, you have to make sure you have the time and resources to do both. And then 3rd, objections. So recall our Reese's peanut butter, right? Not everyone's happy when the chocolate's in the peanut butter. Some people want to keep the chocolate and peanut butter separate, right? So in the same way, there might be people that don't want to combine qualitative and quantitative methods. They might be more comfortable just using one method and not both, right? So anyone on the research team, do they feel that way? Now 3, the rationale, as we were stating. This is telling us, do we need to do it, right? So the mixed method study is appropriate, right, when we need more than one data source, right? Maybe one method is insufficient to answer the research question, as in our study, right? Perhaps, as in our study, we want to explain or elaborate upon or check up on initial results. So initial quantitative results may be further examined with a follow-up qualitative study like we're doing, right? Or we might want to generalize exploratory findings. So that's sort of the reverse, where we might do a qualitative study first and say, wow, that's very interesting, but it's only 10 or 20 people. Let's expand it into a full quantitative study where it's, 100, 200 people, and see if the same findings and the same themes, the same relationships are indicated in this larger quantitative study relative to the qualitative study. So do you need to do it? 4, field methods, right? So the methods for mixed methods, right? How will you do it? Right, so the mixed method study design varies by 4 factors. 1, the level of interaction between the quantitative and qualitative data, right? Are they combined? Are they not combined? Is one bigger or smaller, right? 2, the relative priority, right? So does the study put more of a priority on quantitative data collection and analysis relative to qualitative, or the other way around? 3, the timing of collecting, right? Quantitative and qualitative collected together or at different time points. And 4, the procedures for mixing the 2 data strands. So keeping that in mind, we're going to apply them and go over the 4 basic mixed method designs, right? So here they are: convergent parallel design 1, 2, explanatory sequential design, and then keep that in mind because there's exploratory sequential design next. It looks sort of alike. And then 4, embedded design. Right, so the first design, right, the convergent parallel design. So here, there's equal priority on the quantitative and qualitative data collection and analysis. Right, so both strands of data are collected together. Right, so then the databases are combined, to see if the results are similar or dissimilar. Right, so that's number 1. Number 2, which is our design, the explanatory sequential, where priority is given to the quantitative. Right? So you have that initial quantitative analysis that provided our findings, like our findings in our quantitative said, move all those classes to the evening, right? That class attendance is the big predictor, right? However, we have a follow-up qualitative, that is used to examine those initial quantitative findings. Now the exploratory sequential, the emphasis is on the qualitative rather than the quantitative, right? The qualitative is collected first. The quantitative is collected later, right? Same thing. So the quantitative data are used to build or explain the initial qualitative findings. Then we have number 4, which is a little more involved here, right? So the emphasis can be on either the qualitative or the quantitative, right? The one data set may play a secondary role, right? Such as in here, you see the qualitative data is used to examine the process of the intervention, but the intervention itself is measured quantitatively. Now, when we go into step 5 and we look at collecting the qualitative and quantitative data, right? Of course, the objective is to gather information to answer our research question, right? However, what we need to do here is reconcile the difference between purposive and probability sampling, or probabilistic sampling, right? So specifically, qualitative research tends to use purposive sampling, right? So for the sample, participants are often selected, based on their experience. So if we're studying a certain phenomenon and we meet people who have experienced it, purpose of sampling might be to include them in the sample. Right? And it might be a smaller sample, as is, typical for qualitative studies, with carefully selected people. Now, that differs from quantitative research because in quantitative research, the sampling is probabilistic, where we want a large number of study participants, right, that make up our sample that reflect a larger study population, right? So you see the dichotomy here, right? One's a small group based on their experience, and the other's a larger group, so we could generalize to a study population. So in our study, right, we sort of circumvented this issue, not on purpose, just by what was asked of us, because our study was based on the power analysis to make sure we had statistical power, and they wanted us to interview all the residents as is. So we ended up with 100 study participants, which is enough for statistical power, right? And we are going to achieve saturation and redundancy because everybody's been interviewed, right? As we said, it probably, you know, as you can see in our interviews, just from the first few, you could see in just the first few, the same themes are coming forward, right, about preference of class instructor. So probably you could say if we only had 10 or 20 study participants, we would pick up those themes, right? So there's not much written on mixed methods data collection. However, considerations like this are important and worthy of study. So other questions you want to ask regarding data collection, right? Will the two samples include the same participants, right? Will the quantitative and qualitative samples be the same, right? And will the same concepts be assessed, quantitative and qualitatively? So we're going to go into that a little more here. So, for example, in our study, right, the two samples, right, it's the same number of people. We have 100 residents providing quantitative data, and the follow-up are the same 100 residents providing the qualitative data. Right? Same thing for the sample size. Right? As we said, it's 100 people at one point and 100 people at the second point, right? So we can compare them both. Now, the thing to keep in mind is if it's a different size sample, right, for the qualitative and quantitative, that impacts analysis. Right? For example, if we have 100 people at time point 1, the quantitative, and at time point 2 for the qualitative, there's only 30, right? You can only make a direct comparison between the quantitative and qualitative data for 30 people, because there's only 30 people common to each time point. So if you're making a study design and you plan to have fewer people in the qualitative or the quantitative relative to the other strand, you need to keep this in mind, that a full comparison won't be possible. Right? And that's a major point. Right? So will the same concepts be assessed quantitative and qualitatively? Right? So it's very possible they might not be. But in our study, you know, there are factors that impact class attendance, right? Meditation class attendance, and they're both assessed qualitative and quantitatively. Now, here's our primary process today, the analyzing of the data. So mixed methods data analysis, right, involves looking across both strands of the data, the qualitative and quantitative. Inferences in mixed methods research are conclusions or interpretations based on one strand, right, based on either the qualitative or quantitative. Meta-inferences, which you could tell is a little, you know, enhanced, right? Meta-inferences are inferences drawn from both the qualitative and quantitative strands, which is the purpose of our study, right? That's what we want. Now, the goal is to improve the quality of the inferences by addressing the two data sources. So here we go. So there were 7 steps. I guess the magic number is 7 these days. There were 7 steps for the mixed method study. There's also 7 steps in data analysis for the mixed method study. So this is one step, step 6, and it's also broken up into 7 smaller steps. The first one being data reduction, right? That's the analysis of the quantitative and qualitative. We did that already. And then 6B, data display, is putting those findings in tables for us to look at. We did that already. Then 6C is data transformation, where we either take our qualitative data and make it quantitative, or vice versa. And then 6D, data correlation. So we look, not based on actual inferential analysis yet, but we look and we see what variables seem to be related to one another, right? So we're looking conceptually. So 6E, data consolidation, right? So both data sets have to be put into one database, right? So we can look at them together, which occurs in 6F, right? Step 6F, data comparison, where we're comparing the two forms of data. And then finally, step 6G, which is data integration. That's where we're doing the data analysis based on both sets of data.